Just past midnight on December 29, 1943, Lieutenant Commander John Coy stood on the bridge of USS Silversides, rain squalls hammering the submarine's deck as she plunged through black Pacific waters at 20 knots. The radar scope below showed what his eyes could not: 6 Japanese merchant ships steaming in tight formation, escorted by destroyers whose crews believed darkness made them safe. They were wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The decision Coy was about to make violated every principle that United States Navy submarine commanders had been taught before the war. Pre-war doctrine dictated caution: submerge at dawn, hide deep, attack from periscope depth using sonar. Never, under any circumstances, charge across open ocean on the surface at night where enemy lookouts or destroyers could spot you. That doctrine had produced 2 years of catastrophic failure. Now, in December 1943, American submarine captains like Coy were rewriting the rules through a radical tactic that seemed suicidal: racing toward enemy convoys on the surface in darkness, using speed and radar to hunt prey that outnumbered them, outgunned them, and desperately wanted to kill them. Silversides would sink 3 ships before dawn, 16 torpedoes fired, 3 Japanese vessels totaling over 7,000 tons sent to the bottom in 5 hours. And this was not exceptional. This was becoming routine. The transformation from cautious, ineffective stalkers to aggressive surface raiders represented one of the most dramatic tactical evolutions in naval history, driven by commanders willing to risk everything because the old ways were killing their boats and accomplishing nothing. The American submarine force entered World War II believing it knew how to fight. 20 years of peacetime training had established doctrine built on assumptions that seemed unquestionable. Submarines were scouts for the battle fleet. Submarines attacked from deep submersion using sonar for targeting. Submarines avoided surface combat because surface ships and aircraft could easily detect them. These principles, ingrained through thousands of training exercises, produced cautious commanders who approached every patrol as though enemy forces possessed magical abilities to find submarines that dared operate aggressively. December 7, 1941 shattered American confidence in almost everything, but the submarine force clung to its doctrine even as war made its inadequacies obvious. The Pacific Fleet's submarine force escaped Pearl Harbor undamaged. 29 fleet submarines at Pearl Harbor, another 29 based in the Philippines. These boats represented America's only offensive capability in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. They deployed immediately, carrying outdated tactics into combat against an enemy that had been fighting for 4 years and knew exactly how submarines should die. The results were catastrophic. Through 1942 and into 1943, American submarines achieved remarkably little despite aggressive patrol schedules and brave crews. Boats returned from 60-day patrols, having fired torpedoes at multiple targets, and sunk nothing. Skippers wrote detailed reports describing perfect attacks that produced no results. The submarine force's reputation declined while losses mounted. Multiple factors contributed to this failure, but one fundamental problem undermined everything. American submarines were hunting the wrong way. Pre-war training had emphasized submerged approaches during daylight hours, using sound-ranging equipment to estimate target positions before firing torpedoes from distances exceeding 2,000 yards. This method required boats to dive before dawn, operate at periscope depth throughout daylight hours, then surface only at night to recharge batteries before diving again the next morning. Cautious commanders remained submerged even longer, surfacing only briefly when absolutely necessary for battery charging. This conservative approach made contact with enemy shipping extraordinarily difficult. A submerged submarine traveling on battery power could make perhaps 8 knots for short periods, but sustained operations demanded much slower speeds to conserve battery capacity. 3 to 4 knots submerged speed was typical for extended patrolling. Meanwhile, Japanese merchant convoys steamed at 10 to 12 knots. The mathematics were devastating. A submarine operating submerged at 3 knots that spotted a convoy 12 knots distant had virtually no ability to intercept unless the convoy happened to sail directly toward the submarine's position, compounding the speed problem. Submerged submarines possessed extremely limited visual range. A periscope raised above the surface provided the only way to see targets, but Japanese lookouts could spot periscope wakes at considerable distances during daylight. Commanders raised periscopes briefly, took quick observations, then lowered them before enemy forces could detect the exposure. These momentary glimpses provided insufficient information for effective pursuit. Sound-ranging equipment could detect propeller noise but could not determine target size, course, or speed with accuracy sufficient for successful attacks. The ineffectiveness became embarrassing. Through 1942, despite American submarines conducting hundreds of patrols and firing thousands of torpedoes, Japanese merchant shipping losses to submarine attack remained relatively light. Japan continued moving men, equipment, and supplies across the Pacific with acceptable losses. American submarine commanders returned to base frustrated, demoralized, certain they had lined up perfect shots only to have targets escape undamaged. Some skippers faced relief from command after multiple unsuccessful patrols, their careers destroyed by an impossible tactical situation, compounded by defective torpedoes that frequently failed to explode even when they hit their targets. The torpedo problem deserves acknowledgement because it devastated morale throughout 1942 and into mid-1943. The Mark 14 torpedo, standard equipment on all American fleet submarines, suffered from multiple catastrophic design flaws. The depth control mechanism frequently ran deeper than set, causing torpedoes to pass harmlessly beneath target hulls. The magnetic exploder designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel malfunctioned constantly, either exploding prematurely or not exploding at all. The contact exploder, meant to function when a torpedo struck a target directly, frequently failed because the firing pin collapsed on impact rather than triggering detonation. These problems persisted because the Bureau of Ordnance refused to believe their weapons were defective, blaming submarine commanders for poor shooting despite overwhelming evidence of systemic mechanical failure. By September 1943, the torpedo crisis was finally being resolved through the efforts of Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood and determined submarine commanders who conducted unauthorized testing to prove the weapons were faulty. But even with working torpedoes, the tactical approach remained fundamentally inadequate. Submarines that could not intercept targets could not sink them regardless of torpedo reliability. The solution emerged not through official doctrine revision, but through individual commanders experimenting with techniques that pre-war training had dismissed as reckless. USS Wahoo's Third War Patrol in January and February 1943 demonstrated what aggressive tactics could achieve. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, newly assigned as Wahoo's commanding officer, possessed a personality distinctly incompatible with cautious doctrine. Morton believed submarines should hunt like wolves, not hide like frightened prey. On this patrol to New Guinea waters, Morton implemented a radical operating procedure. Wahoo would cruise on the surface during darkness, and for 1 hour after dawn and before dusk, using visual lookouts rather than periscopes to search for targets. This approach multiplied Wahoo's effective search radius dramatically. A submarine traveling on the surface using diesel engines could sustain 20 knots indefinitely, consuming fuel but achieving 5 times the speed of submerged operation. Visual lookouts stationed on the bridge could see to the horizon, approximately 12 miles in good weather, compared to the few hundred yards visible through a periscope at wave level. Running on the surface made Wahoo visible to enemy lookouts if they happened to be looking in the right direction at the right moment, but darkness provided concealment, and Morton calculated that the increased probability of finding targets justified the increased risk of detection. The calculation proved correct. Wahoo found targets. On January 24, 1943, surface lookouts spotted a Japanese convoy heading toward WWII Harbor in New Guinea. Morton shadowed the convoy on the surface. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Maintaining contact through the night, then executed an audacious maneuver that became legendary in submarine force history. He took Wahoo into WWII Harbor itself, pursuing the convoy into what was essentially a Japanese naval base, surrounded by enemy shore installations and protected by destroyers. Entering an enemy harbor represented exactly the kind of aggressive action that pre-war doctrine had taught commanders to avoid. The risks were enormous: unknown water depths, uncharted reefs, multiple Japanese destroyers, no room to maneuver if discovered, shore batteries that could sink a submarine before it could dive. Yet Morton charged in anyway, confident that audacity provided better protection than caution. Inside WWII Harbor, Wahoo found a Japanese destroyer anchored near the entrance. Morton positioned Wahoo for a close-range attack. The destroyer's crew spotted the submarine and got underway, charging directly at Wahoo to ram her before she could submerge. Most submarine commanders would have crash-dived immediately, abandoning the attack to save their boat. Morton ordered full ahead, charging straight toward the destroyer in a tactic he called down the throat. At 800 yards separation, with the destroyer bearing down at full speed, Morton fired a single torpedo. Direct hit. The destroyer Harusame exploded and sank within minutes. Wahoo escaped WWII Harbor, returned to open ocean, and continued hunting. On January 26th, surface lookouts spotted another convoy, 5 merchant ships with escorts. Morton began a surface approach, maneuvering Wahoo ahead of the convoy to achieve attack position. The technique, called an end around, exploited the submarine's surface speed to race past the convoy's flank, then position ahead of the convoy's projected course before submerging for the attack. Pre-war doctrine discouraged this maneuver as too risky, requiring hours of surface running during which enemy aircraft or surface units might detect the submarine. Morton had determined that the risk was acceptable given the alternative of watching convoys steam past beyond engagement range. The end around succeeded. Wahoo intercepted the convoy, attacked Submerged, and sank the transport Buyo Maru carrying Japanese troops. What happened next remains controversial. When Wahoo surfaced after the attack to pursue fleeing ships, Morton found the ocean filled with Japanese soldiers in lifeboats and clinging to wreckage. Morton ordered the deck guns to engage these survivors, arguing that allowing trained enemy soldiers to reach shore would cost American lives later. The action remains debated by historians, but Morton's justification reflected his fundamental philosophy. Submarines existed to kill the enemy by any available means, and hesitation preserved enemy capability to kill Americans. Wahoo's third patrol sank 4 ships and damaged several others, demonstrating beyond question that aggressive surface tactics produced results impossible through cautious submerged approaches. Morton returned to Pearl Harbor in February 1943 to a hero's welcome. A broom lashed to Wahoo's periscope symbolized a clean sweep of enemy targets encountered. Morton's aggressive style and spectacular results made him an icon within the submarine force. Other commanders began studying his methods, recognizing that the old doctrine had failed and new approaches were desperately needed. But Morton's tactics alone could not transform the submarine force without a technological advantage that made surface operations dramatically more effective: radar. In mid-1942, American submarines began receiving the SJ, a surface search radar, a 10-centimeter wavelength system that could detect ships at distances exceeding 10 miles. Earlier, SD air search radar had provided crude warning of aircraft, but SJ radar transformed surface operations by allowing submarines to see targets in complete darkness. Radar fundamentally changed submarine warfare by eliminating darkness as a protection for Japanese shipping. Prior to radar, nighttime provided safety for convoys because submarines operating on the surface could not spot distant ships in darkness, except through visual sighting, which required being close enough to see silhouettes against the horizon. Ships traveling at night often remained unseen unless a submarine happened to be positioned directly in their path. Radar allowed submarines to detect convoys from distances far beyond visual range, day or night, providing exact bearing and range information that enabled submarine commanders to calculate intercept courses with precision. By early 1943, all American submarines in the Pacific had been retrofitted with SJ radar. The technology arrived simultaneously with other improvements: working torpedoes after September 1943, broken Japanese codes that revealed convoy routes and schedules, and most critically, a new generation of aggressive commanders inspired by officers like Dudley Morton, who demonstrated that surface attacks produced results worth the risks. These factors combined to transform American submarine operations from ineffective to devastating in less than a year. The transformation required one additional element: replacing cautious commanders with aggressive ones. Vice Admiral Lockwood, commanding submarines in the Pacific, recognized that pre-war training had produced officers who followed doctrine religiously, even when doctrine failed. Lockwood began relieving commanders who returned from 2 patrols without significant results, replacing them with younger officers willing to adopt the new aggressive tactics. This practice, controversial within the Navy's traditional promotion system, accelerated the tactical revolution by ensuring that submarines were commanded by officers who would use them effectively. The combination of working torpedoes, effective radar, decoded enemy communications, and aggressive commanders created conditions for systematic destruction of Japanese merchant shipping. By 1944, American submarines were no longer hunting blindly. They received intelligence about convoy routes, used radar to locate targets in darkness, executed surface approaches at high speed to achieve attack positions, then pressed attacks until targets were destroyed or the submarine was driven off by escorts. The cautious, submerged tactics of 1942 had been replaced by relentless surface pursuit that gave Japanese convoys nowhere to hide. The Japanese responded poorly to this transformation. Imperial Japanese Navy doctrine had always emphasized offensive surface fleet action over defensive convoy protection. Japan allocated insufficient destroyers and escort vessels to protecting merchant shipping, believing that aggressive fleet operations would win the war before convoy losses became critical. This miscalculation proved catastrophic as American submarines began systematically sinking merchant ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. Japanese anti-submarine capabilities remained primitive throughout the war. Japanese destroyers lacked effective radar, possessed inferior sonar systems compared to American equivalents, and employed ineffective depth charge tactics. When American submarines conducted surface night attacks, Japanese escorts often failed to detect them until torpedoes hit their targets. Even when escorts did detect submarines, their depth charges frequently missed because American boats could dive quickly and maneuver underwater to evade attack patterns. More critically, Japan developed an effective convoy system comparable to the Allied system in the Atlantic. Japanese convoys often sailed with inadequate escort, traveled predictable routes, maintained poor anti-submarine screening procedures, and lacked coordinated air cover. These deficiencies made Japanese merchant shipping increasingly vulnerable as the American submarine force grew in size and aggressiveness through 1944. USS Silversides exemplified the transformed submarine force. Commissioned just 8 days after Pearl Harbor on December 15, 1941, Silversides was a Gato-class fleet submarine measuring 312 feet long, powered by 4 Fairbanks Morse diesel engines capable of 20 knots surface speed. She carried 24 torpedoes, could dive to 300 feet, and sustained 90-day patrols across 12,000 miles of ocean. Her crew of 8 officers and 72 enlisted men operated in cramped conditions where the smell of comer, diesel fuel mixed with the sweat of men who could not bathe regularly. Silverside's first war patrol began April 30, 1942, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Creed Burlingame. This patrol operated under old doctrine: cautious, submerged approaches, limited surface time, attacks from maximum range using sonar estimates. Results were modest. 1 cargo ship sunk, another damaged. Burlingame returned to Pearl Harbor disappointed but determined to improve. By Silverside's 4th war patrol in December 1942, the tactical evolution was underway. Burlingame began experimenting with longer surface runs, more aggressive positioning, closer range attacks. On Christmas Eve, 1942, while far at sea off the Solomon Islands, a crisis developed that demonstrated the extreme conditions submarine crews endured. Fireman Second Class George Platter developed acute appendicitis, a condition that would kill him without surgery. No doctor aboard. The submarine was surrounded by Japanese naval forces in enemy-controlled waters. But pharmacist's mate First Class Thomas Moore had witnessed appendectomies during training, though never performed one. The crew improvised an operating theatre in the officers' wardroom. Kitchen utensils were fashioned into surgical instruments. An ironing board propped up Platter's feet because the wardroom table was too short. Burlingame ordered Silversides to dive, submerging to provide stable conditions for surgery despite partially charged batteries. Moore consulted a medical textbook and began cutting. 4 hours later, Platter was stitched up and alive. 6 days later, he was standing watch. The operation succeeded under conditions that would have killed most patients in any hospital, demonstrating the extraordinary resilience and improvisation that submarine warfare demanded. When Silversides surfaced after the surgery, Japanese destroyers immediately detected her and forced a crash dive. Depth. Charges exploded around the submarine for hours, while Platter lay recovering in the wardroom. The crew endured the attack in silence, knowing that any noise might help enemy sonar operators target them more accurately. This was submarine warfare, life-threatening medical emergencies handled in enemy waters while destroyers tried to kill everyone aboard. Silversides' transformation into an aggressive hunter accelerated through 1943 as radar was installed, torpedoes became reliable, and command passed to Lieutenant Commander John Coy in June 1943. Coy embodied the new aggressive spirit. He understood that submarines possessed decisive advantages in surface night operations: speed to chase targets, radar to see in darkness, and low profiles that made visual detection difficult even when running on the surface. Japanese convoys, traveling without radar, relied entirely on visual lookouts who were nearly blind at night. Coy's first patrol as Silversides commander in July 1943 demonstrated his commitment to aggressive tactics. Operating off Japan's home islands near Kisuido, one of the main approaches to the inland sea, Silversides hunted convoys with systematic precision. Radar detected targets at distances exceeding 10 miles. Coy would plot their course and speed, calculate an intercept, then race ahead on the surface at 20 knots to achieve attack position. The entire process occurred in darkness, with Japanese lookouts oblivious to the submarine's presence until torpedoes struck. On July 28, radar detected a 4,000-ton cargo ship. Coy closed to firing range, launched torpedoes, and sank the vessel. On August 8, radar found the passenger cargo ship Nikkei Maru. Torpedoes sent her to the bottom. On August 14, a large enemy tanker appeared on radar. Silversides pursued through the night, damaged the tanker with torpedo hits, then submerged before dawn to evade air search. The patrol demonstrated systematic exploitation of American technological advantages: radar for detection, surface speed for positioning, torpedoes for destruction. But the tactic that would define Silverside's legend occurred on January 18, 1943, during her fourth patrol. Intelligence from decoded Japanese communications indicated that the 10,000-ton tanker Toei Maru would reach Truk at 10 minutes past midnight. Burlingame, still commanding at that time, positioned Silversides along the predicted route and waited. At the designated time, radar detected the massive tanker steaming exactly where intelligence predicted. This was warfare transformed by code breaking. No more searching blind across millions of square miles of ocean, no more luck-dependent encounters. American intelligence told submarine commanders where targets would be, submarines intercepted them with radar precision, and torpedoes destroyed them. Target of the war: 10,022 tons of desperately needed fuel sent to the bottom in one attack. The loss represented not just tonnage but strategic degradation of Japan's ability to fuel its war machine. Every tanker sunk meant fighters grounded, ships immobilized, industrial production curtailed. Japan entered the war with just enough tanker capacity to sustain operations. American submarines were systematically destroying that capacity faster than Japan could replace it. 2 days after sinking Toei Maru, Silversides achieved one of her most productive days of the war. After tracking a convoy throughout daylight hours, staying submerged to avoid detection, Koi surfaced at sundown and began an end-around maneuver. Racing ahead of the convoy at maximum speed, Silversides positioned herself directly in the convoy's path, then submerged and waited. As the convoy moved into torpedo range, Koi fired at overlapping targets, cargo ships steaming so close together that missing one meant hitting another. 3 ships sank within minutes: Surabaya Maru, Somdono Maru, and Mayu Maru. During this attack, a torpedo became stuck in a forward tube after being fired. The weapon was armed, its warhead live, lodged in a tube with its engine still running. Any mechanical failure could detonate the torpedo and destroy Silversides from within. The crew could not disarm the weapon safely, leaving only one option: attempt to refire it despite the enormous risk. Koi ordered Silversides into full reverse, backing away at maximum speed while the torpedo crew prepared to fire. The torpedo shot from the tube, disappeared toward the horizon, and did not explode inside the submarine. The crew had just survived one of the most dangerous moments possible in submarine warfare through skill and desperate courage. By December 1943, when Koi took Silversides on the patrol that opened this story, the submarine force's transformation was complete. The night of December 29th, 1943, perfectly demonstrated evolved tactics. Radar detected the convoy at distances exceeding visual range. Koi plotted the convoy's formation: 2 columns of 3 ships each, several small escorts, speed 10 knots, destination Palau by dawn. Silversides had 5 hours to intercept, attack, and escape before daylight made surface operations suicidal. Koi ordered flank speed, charging toward the convoy on the surface through rain squalls that provided additional concealment. At 20 knots, Silversides could overtake any merchant convoy close to torpedo range and launch attacks from positions Japanese escorts did not anticipate. The escorts were searching for submarines ahead of the convoy or alongside it, traditional threat axes. They were not expecting a submarine to race past their flank, loop ahead, then attack from the front. Silversides reached attack position shortly after midnight. Koi began the attack run, closing to effective torpedo range. Japanese lookouts finally spotted the submarine's wake, a white trail in black water visible only at close range. Escorts turned to engage, but Silversides was already firing. 6 torpedoes launched at the nearest cargo ship. 3 hit. Flames erupting from ruptured fuel bunkers, the vessel settling rapidly by the stern. Koi ordered Silversides to turn, presenting stern torpedo tubes toward other targets. 4 more torpedoes launched at a second cargo ship. 2 hits. The ship exploded with such force that debris rained down across hundreds of yards of ocean. Koi suspected the ship carried ammunition or fuel, cargo that transformed hits into catastrophic destruction. While escorts searched frantically for the attacking submarine, Silversides reloaded torpedo tubes and maneuvered for another attack. The third target, a large transport, attempted to flee at maximum speed. Koi pursued on the surface, maintaining radar contact, waiting for the optimal firing position. At 3,000 yards range, Silversides launched 6 torpedoes in a spread pattern designed to hit the target, regardless of evasive maneuvering. 4 torpedoes struck the transport. The ship stopped dead in the water, fires visible for miles, then capsized and sank. 3 ships destroyed, 16 torpedoes fired, 5 hours from initial contact to final sinking. Then Silversides dove before dawn and escaped, leaving the convoy's survivors to wonder how one submarine had devastated their formation in darkness. This attack pattern repeated across the Pacific through 1944 as more submarines adopted surface night tactics. Commander Richard O'Kane, who had served as executive officer under Dudley Morton on Oahu, took command of USS Tang in October 1943 and pushed aggressive tactics to their extreme. O'Kane believed that the ideal attack position was inside an enemy convoy, surrounded by targets, firing torpedoes at ships ahead and behind. Simultaneously, most submarine commanders considered this suicidal. O'Kane executed it repeatedly and survived through exceptional ship handling and absolute confidence in his crew's abilities. Tang's third patrol into the Yellow Sea in June and July 1944 demonstrated O'Kane's methods at their most audacious. On June 30th, Tang intercepted a 6-ship convoy. O'Kane conducted a surface approach in broad daylight, relying on Tang's low profile and the Japanese lookout's inexperience to remain undetected. He positioned Tang between 2 columns of merchant ships, essentially placing his submarine in the middle of the enemy formation. Then he began firing. Torpedoes launched forward hit one cargo ship. Torpedoes launched aft hit another. Tang turned to engage a third target. More torpedoes. The convoy disintegrated into chaos, ships scattering in panic, escorts confused about the submarine's location because attacks came from inside their protective screen. Over 4 days, Tang sank 10 ships on this patrol, the most productive single submarine patrol of the entire war. O'Kane's willingness to take extreme risks, combined with Tang's crew executing complex maneuvers flawlessly under combat pressure, demonstrated how far submarine tactics had evolved from the cautious doctrine of 1942. O'Kane would be credited with sinking 33 ships over Tang's 5 war patrols before the submarine was destroyed by one of her own malfunctioning torpedoes on October 24, 1944. O'Kane and 8 crew members survived, spending the war's final months as prisoners of the Japanese. The aggressive surface night tactics that commanders like Morton, Coy, O'Kane, and dozens of others pioneered came with enormous risks. Operating on the surface made submarines vulnerable to detection by radar-equipped Japanese ships, though such ships remained rare. Surface running exposed submarines to aircraft attack, particularly dangerous, near dawn or dusk, when aircraft could spot submarines caught on the surface during the transition between darkness and daylight. Charging into convoy formations meant sailing into concentrations of Japanese destroyers specifically tasked with killing submarines. The casualty rate reflected these dangers. Of the approximately 16,000 American submariners who served in the Pacific during World War II, 375 officers and 3,131 enlisted men were killed, a total fatality rate of approximately 22%. This was among the highest casualty rates of any branch of American military service during the war. 52 submarines were lost in the Pacific. Some disappeared without trace, their fates unknown until post-war Japanese records revealed where and how they died. Others went down in documented attacks, their crews fighting until the end. USS Oahu, the submarine that had pioneered aggressive tactics under Dudley Morton, was lost on October 11, 1943, while attempting to exit the Sea of Japan through La Perouse Strait. Japanese aircraft detected Oahu on the surface, attacked with bombs and depth charges, then called in patrol boats that finished the destruction. 79 men died with their submarine, including Morton. The loss devastated the submarine force. Morton had become an icon of aggressive warfare, an inspiration to commanders throughout the Pacific. His death reminded everyone that aggressive tactics, while effective, carried deadly risks. Despite casualties, the strategic results justified the tactics. By 1944, American submarines were destroying Japanese merchant shipping at rates Japan could not sustain. The nation that entered the war with 7,600,000 tons of merchant shipping capacity was watching that capacity evaporate. Submarines sank tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies, freighters hauling iron ore, transports moving troops and equipment. Each sinking degraded Japan's ability to wage war. The full scope of the submarine campaign's effectiveness became clear in 1944 when submarines sank 603 Japanese ships, totaling 2,700,000 tons. This exceeded the total tonnage submarines had sunk in all previous years of the war combined. American submarines were not merely successful, they were achieving strategic victory through systematic destruction of Japan's merchant fleet. By the end of 1944, Japanese convoy routes through open ocean were nearly abandoned. Surviving merchant ships hugged coastal waters too shallow for submarine operations, accepting slower transit times and congested ports to avoid deep water where American submarines hunted. The intelligence advantage American submarines enjoyed through mid-1943 until war's end multiplied their effectiveness beyond what tactics and technology alone could achieve. The broken Maru Code that revealed Japanese merchant ship positions and routes allowed submarines to position themselves along convoy paths with precision. Submarine commanders received daily intelligence reports showing where specific convoys would be, what ships comprised them, what cargo they carried, and when they would reach specific coordinates. This transformed submarine warfare from random hunting across vast ocean to calculated interception of known targets. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant marine crews became severe. Sailors knew that American submarines hunted with apparent omniscience, appearing exactly where convoys traveled despite the Pacific's immense size. They understood that darkness no longer protected them because American radar saw through night. They recognized that Japanese escorts could not effectively defend against submarines that attacked with ruthless precision, then disappeared before depth charges could reach them. Morale collapsed. Experienced merchant marine officers and crew died in sinking after sinking, replaced by less experienced personnel who often panicked during submarine attacks. Japanese naval leadership refused to acknowledge the submarine threat's severity until too late. The Imperial Japanese Navy had always emphasized offensive operations, aircraft carriers striking enemy fleets, battleships engaging in decisive surface actions, submarines attacking enemy warships. The concept of defensive convoy escort, protecting vulnerable merchant ships from submarine attack, received inadequate attention throughout the war. Japan allocated insufficient destroyers and escort vessels to convoy duty, maintained inadequate training for anti-submarine warfare, and failed to develop technological countermeasures like effective shipboard radar and improved sonar systems. This institutional failure to prioritize merchant ship protection proved catastrophic. Japan was an island nation dependent on imported resources. Oil from the Dutch East Indies fueled Japanese industry and military. Iron ore, rubber, food, and countless other materials traveled by sea from conquered territories to Japanese factories. When American submarines began systematically sinking the ships carrying these resources, Japan's war economy began collapsing, regardless of tactical victories. Japanese forces achieved elsewhere. By December 1944, Japan imported only 5 million barrels of oil, compared to the 28,500,000 barrels projected as necessary to sustain war operations. Industrial production declined sharply. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. Ships remained in port because fuel allocations were insufficient for operations. Training programs for new pilots were curtailed, producing inadequately trained aviators who died quickly in combat. The submarine blockade was strangling Japan. The final phase of the submarine campaign involved one of the war's most daring operations. The Sea of Japan, enclosed by Japanese home islands, Korea, and Soviet territory, had been declared off-limits to American submarines after Oahu's loss in October 1943. Japanese defensive mining had made the entrances to this inland sea extremely dangerous. However, by early 1945, American submarines were running out of targets in open ocean. Japanese shipping had retreated to the Sea of Japan, believing it was safe from submarine attack. Vice Admiral Lockwood decided to penetrate the Sea of Japan with a force equipped with new FM frequency-modulated sonar specifically designed to detect mines. The system, nicknamed Hell's Bells for the clear chime it emitted when detecting a mine, allowed submarines to navigate through minefields that would otherwise be impassable. Operation Barney sent 9 submarines through Tsushima Straits minefields in June 1945 to attack shipping inside the Sea of Japan. The submarines navigated the minefields successfully, surfaced inside the Sea of Japan, and began hunting with devastating effect. Japanese shipping in the Sea of Japan had operated without submarine attacks for nearly 2 years. Merchant ships traveled without escorts, made no attempt at anti-submarine evasion, and were completely unprepared for American submarines to appear. Over 10 days, the 9 submarines sank 28 ships, totaling approximately 54,000 tons before exiting through the minefields and returning to base. Operation Barney demonstrated that nowhere in Japanese-controlled waters remained safe from American submarines. USS Silversides concluded her 14th and final war patrol in July 1945. Over 3 years and 4 months of continuous combat operations, Silversides had sunk 23 confirmed Japanese ships, totaling 90,080 tons, according to post-war Japanese records. This made Silversides the third most successful American submarine, by number of ships sunk, behind only USS Tang and USS Tautog. Silversides received 12 battle stars and a Presidential Unit citation recognizing her extraordinary combat record. The individual stories behind these statistics revealed the human dimension of submarine warfare. Every patrol meant 60 to 90 days submerged in cramped steel tubes, where 100 men shared space with diesel engines, torpedoes, and machinery. Fresh food lasted perhaps 2 weeks before giving way to canned rations. Fresh water was severely rationed. Bathing was irregular. The temperature inside submarines operating in tropical waters exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, cooking food, and battery acid created an atmosphere that newcomers found nauseating. Combat brought terror that veteran submariners learned to manage through training and camaraderie. Depth charge attacks created explosive shocks that threw men off their feet, shattered light bulbs, sprung leaks, and demonstrated conclusively that a thin steel hull provided inadequate protection against high explosives. Submarines dove deep to escape, crews maintaining absolute silence while listening to destroyers' propellers overhead, depth charges exploding in patterns designed to crush the hull. Some attacks lasted hours. Men endured in darkness because running lights might somehow help enemy sonar. They breathed recycled air that grew stale and thin. They waited for the attack to end, or for the hull to rupture and the ocean to flood in. Yet these same crews returned to port, took brief shore leave, then went back to sea for another patrol because the job required it. The submarine force maintained patrol schedules throughout the war with remarkable consistency. As one submarine returned, another departed. The cycle continued relentlessly. Patrol, refit, patrol again. Some boats completed 14 patrols, like Silversides. Others were lost on their first patrol. The randomness of survival created bonds between crews that lasted lifetimes. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, American submarines had achieved strategic victory far exceeding their numbers or percentage of total naval forces. The submarine force, representing less than 2% of the United States Navy's personnel, had sunk approximately 55% of all Japanese shipping lost to all causes during the war. This included 5,300,000 tons of merchant shipping, according to post-war assessments, though wartime estimates had been significantly higher. More than tonnage statistics, submarines had accomplished what surface fleets and strategic bombing could not: complete strangulation of Japan's war economy. By August 1945, Japan's oil imports had essentially ceased. Industrial production had collapsed to a fraction of wartime peaks. The Japanese merchant marine had been destroyed as an effective force. Even if Japan had possessed the will to continue fighting, it lacked the logistical capability to sustain military operations. The submarine blockade had rendered Japan incapable of waging war regardless of other factors. The transformation from cautious pre-war doctrine to aggressive surface night attacks had required approximately 2 years from December 1941 to late 1943. That transformation was driven by commanders willing to discard failed tactics despite institutional resistance. by technological advantages like radar that America possessed and Japan lacked, by code-breaking intelligence that revealed enemy movements, and by working torpedoes that finally arrived in late 1943. But most fundamentally, the transformation required recognizing that submarines possessed decisive advantages in surface operations that outweighed the risks. The speed advantage was mathematical and inescapable. A submarine on the surface at 20 knots could chase any merchant convoy and achieve attack positions impossible at submerged speeds. Radar detection ranges exceeding 10 miles gave submarines time to calculate intercepts and position for attacks. Low profiles made visual detection difficult even in daylight and nearly impossible in darkness. These factors combined to create conditions where submarines could hunt merchant shipping with effectiveness that Japanese anti-submarine forces could not counter. Japanese failures compounded American advantages. Inadequate radar deployment left Japanese ships blind in darkness. Inferior sonar systems made submarines difficult to detect even after attacks. Insufficient escort allocations meant convoys traveled with inadequate protection. Poor anti-submarine tactical doctrine meant escorts responded ineffectively even when they detected submarines. Institutional refusal to prioritize convoy protection allowed the submarine threat to grow unchecked until it became catastrophic. By the time Japanese leadership recognized the severity of the submarine campaign, it was too late to implement effective countermeasures. The lessons from the Pacific submarine campaign extended far beyond World War II. Post-war naval thinking incorporated the demonstrated effectiveness of submarine commerce warfare against island nations dependent on sea transport. The revelation that cautious doctrine could paralyze an otherwise capable force influenced military thinking about the dangers of peacetime assumptions that failed under combat conditions. The importance of intelligence, exemplified by broken codes providing submarine target information, became a foundational principle of modern warfare. Perhaps most significantly, the submarine campaign demonstrated that technological advantage combined with aggressive tactics could achieve strategic victory even when numerical superiority seemed to favor the enemy. Japan entered the war with more merchant shipping capacity than American submarines could, theoretically, destroy through random hunting. But American submarines did not hunt randomly. They used intelligence, radar, and aggressive surface tactics to destroy shipping systematically until Japan's war economy collapsed. The transformation from failure in 1942 to strategic victory by 1945 proved that tactical innovation could overcome initial inadequacy when commanders possessed the courage to abandon failed doctrine. USS Silversides was decommissioned on April 17, 1946, having survived the war that killed so many of her sister boats. She served as a Naval Reserve training vessel in Chicago from 1947 until 1969. In 1987, Silversides was moved to Muskegon, Michigan, where she now serves as the centerpiece of the USS Silversides Submarine Museum. Visitors can tour the submarine, walking through the cramped compartments where crews lived, worked, and fought for months at a time. The forward torpedo room shows where 16 men slept on bunks folded alongside 22-foot-long torpedoes weighing 3,000 pounds each. The control room preserves the compressed air manifolds, trim systems, and helm where submarine control parties managed depth, speed, and course during combat operations. Standing inside Silversides today, the immediate impression is claustrophobic. The spaces seem impossibly small for 100 men to inhabit for 90 days at a time. The machinery seems crude compared to modern standards. Yet this primitive steel tube and dozens like her achieved strategic victory against an empire spanning millions of square miles through courage, tactical innovation, and relentless aggression that transformed American submarine warfare from cautious failure to devastating success. The submariners who pioneered surface night attacks understood they were taking enormous risks. Operating on the surface made them vulnerable to detection and attack. Charging into enemy convoy formations meant sailing into concentrations of Japanese destroyers hunting for exactly their kind of target. Racing across open ocean at 20 knots to intercept convoys required hours of surface exposure where aircraft or surface units could spot them. They accepted these risks because the alternative was failure. Dudley Morton, who died pursuing Japanese shipping in the Sea of Japan. Richard O'Kane, who survived Tang's sinking and spent the war's final months as a prisoner. John Coy, who guided Silversides through some of the war's most successful patrols. Creed Burlingame, who commanded Silversides through her early patrols and pioneered aggressive tactics. These commanders and hundreds of others like them rewrote submarine doctrine through combat experience that proved old methods failed and new methods succeeded. Their crews executed the tactics that made success possible. Radar operators who detected convoys in darkness. Torpedo crews who loaded their weapons in minutes while the submarine maneuvered under fire. Engine room crews who maintained diesel engines through thousands of hours of operation in tropical heat. Control room crews who managed depth and trim during attacks and evasion. These men, mostly in their early 20s, performed jobs that required split-second decisions while knowing that mistakes meant death for everyone aboard. The 22% casualty rate testified to the dangers they faced. 3,506 American submariners died in the Pacific War. 52 submarines were lost, many disappeared without survivors, their final moments unknown. Others went down in documented attacks, where some crew members survived to report how their boats died. The randomness of survival haunted veterans for decades afterward. Why did some boats return from patrol after patrol, while others were lost on their first mission? Why did some men survive submarine sinkings while others did not? There were no good answers, only the knowledge that submarine warfare was extraordinarily dangerous, and survival often depended on factors beyond anyone's control. Yet, despite casualties, despite dangers, despite the psychological strain of operating in sealed steel tubes under constant threat of violent death, the submarine force maintained patrol schedules that ensured American submarines were always hunting Japanese shipping. As boats returned to base for refit, others departed for patrol areas. The cycle never stopped from December 1941 until August 1945. This relentless pressure gradually destroyed Japan's merchant fleet until the nation could no longer wage war effectively. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.